Hi, my name is Ken Carter. I am the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Psychology at Oxford College of Emory University, and I want to talk a little bit today and give you a short history of the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, this isn't a history of diagnosis. This is a really history of why we have the DSM and how the DSM has changed over the years. And to the right of the screen, you can see all the previous DSMs. At the very top, almost impossible to see, you've got DSM-1, then DSM-2 is that little yellow book, DSM-3 in green, DSM-3R, DSM-4, DSM-4 text revision, and the most current version of the DSM, which is DSM-5. Before I launch into the history of the DSM, I want to talk a little bit about why we even have psychological diagnosis. Like, why bother with a diagnostic manual at all? Why not just describe what the client might be experiencing to another person? There are some very particular reasons why we might have a diagnostic manual, and you'll find that a lot of people don't love the DSM. In fact, I talk about the DSM as having what I call swing out sister phenomena. Swing Out Sister was a band in the 80s, and they only had one hit, which was Breakout. When they got interviewed about their band, they asked them about their name, like, why did you choose the name Swing Out Sister? And they said, we couldn't find a name we all liked, so we picked a name we all hated, and that was our compromise. And the DSM is a little bit like that. There are lots of different kinds of people that want something from the DSM, and they all get a little bit unsatisfied by what the DSM gives them. But back to our question. Why bother with the diagnostic manual? First of all, it helps us to organize the chaos of all the individual symptoms that a client might experience. For example, if you're familiar with the diagnosis of depression, a person might have 7 or 6 different symptoms of depression, but they don't have 7 different conditions. Understanding how the clusters of the symptoms might occur together will help people to organize all of those individual symptoms. Also, DSM aids in communication. So if one person is explaining to another person that a client might have PTSD, it's a great shortcut for being able to communicate lots of information from one clinician or researcher to another. It can also be a validation of a client's experience. As a clinician myself, there have been times I've actually taken out the DSM and shown the individual symptoms to a client to help them understand that the things that they're experiencing has a name and a typical course and a typical way to treat it as well. It can also help with research. In fact, my early interest in the DSM came from being a researcher and having to do diagnostic interviews all around Michigan, and so I learned a lot about the DSM. It can also help practitioners plan treatments and to establish a prognosis. So different kinds of conditions may have similar symptoms, but the way that you treat it and how it might likely play out over time can be very different. So who uses the DSM? And this goes back to that whole swing out sister phenomena. One of the reasons why the DSM is so imperfect is that the diagnostic manual serves lots of different purposes for different constituencies, and each group wants something very different from the DSM. For example, researchers. What researchers want from the DSM is they use it as a tool for clinical investigation and to determine the course and effectiveness of treatments. If you're a researcher, it might make sense to send a graduate student all around Michigan to do 3-hour interviews to be able to diagnose a client. What you want is a very detailed, specific diagnosis. And so researchers want that detailed, accurate diagnostic criteria, and they may not be as concerned about how long it might take for them to get that diagnosis. On the other hand, practitioners use the DSM often as a tool to understand different conditions, to apply treatment plans, and for reimbursement. So you have mental health practitioners who want this uncomplicated, user-friendly criteria, And on the other side, you have researchers that want something very detailed and it doesn't matter how long it might take. The legal system also uses psychiatric diagnosis for criminal responsibility, for custody rights and insurance payments. And the everyday person, the general public, also can be influenced by the DSM because it really influences the way that we call different conditions and the way that we view mental illness. The 1840 U.S. Census was one of the first times in the United States that we had a diagnostic criteria for mental illness, and it was extremely simple. There was only one category. It was idiocy, insanity. So you either had that or you had nothing. It took them some 40 years or so to come up with a better system. The 1880 census had about 7 different categories, and a lot of these should seem familiar to you today. There's mania, which is probably a lot like bipolar disorder, melancholia, which is undoubtedly like depression, monomania, which is extreme preoccupation, probably a lot like OCD, paresis, which is weakness of voluntary movement. Given when it was, I'm guessing it had probably something to do with syphilis. Then there's dementia, then dipsomania, which is a craving for alcohol. These are the 7 categories you had back in 1880. Now, the grandmother of the DSM was this book. It was the Statistical Manual for the Use of Institutions for the Insane. It came out in 1917, and it was developed by a committee that would eventually become the American Psychiatric Association and the National Commission on Mental Hygiene. It had about 22 disorders in it. Other diagnostic guides that have come out over the years included the Standard Classified Nomenclature of Diseases that came out in 1933, had a psychiatric section, and then the Office of the Surgeon General had a book called Medical 203 and was used primarily by the Veterans Administration. Then, a really interesting thing happened in mid-1800s. There was a book that came out that was called the International Classification of Diseases. And it was a book that was a guide to different kinds of causes of death, otherwise known as mortality, because they wanted to make sure that deaths were recorded in similar ways around the world. It made some sense. The 6th edition to this ICD also included illnesses or information about diseases, otherwise known as morbidity, and it had for the very first time in 1949 a section on mental disorders. Now, apparently in the United States, when they saw this ICD-6, they weren't that happy with it. So there was a commission that was tasked from the American Psychiatric Association to develop a version of that ICD mental health section for use in the United States. And the DSM ended up being an interpretive guide to those ICD mental health conditions. So in the DSM, you'll see some codes there. Those codes are ICD codes. They are to categorize the DSM diagnoses with the International Classification of Diseases. DSM-1 came out in 1952, and it was a very different book than what you may be familiar with today. There weren't as many specific diagnostic criteria. It was really an adaptation of that Medical 203 book and the Standard Nomenclature of Diseases. Very psychoanalytic in its approach. The disorders were listed briefly and then defined. The big purpose of the DSM-1 was really used to keep statistical records. DSM-2 came out in 1968, still very psychoanalytic. It was aligned a little bit better with the ICD. Disorders were listed briefly in paragraphs, which pretty much allowed people to diagnose and interpret the DSM in any way they wanted to. It really wasn't that reliable. And then something really interesting happened. The Rosenhan pseudo-patient studies. Now, if you're familiar with the Rosenhan studies, there are 2 things I want to point out about them. Number one, it really led to the death of DSM-2. And there's another sort of interesting thing I'll talk about in just a moment. But Rosenhan was a psychologist, and he was very interested in views of mental health and mental illness, and he had a lot of fairly dedicated graduate students. And what Rosenhan did was he went all around the country in 1973, and he had these sort of fake patients or pseudo patients present themselves to psychiatric hospitals with a single complaint. The complaint apparently was, I'm hearing a voice that says thud, Thud. Apparently they chose that because it wasn't really linked to any psychological condition specifically. But people were supposed to present to these hospitals, said that they heard this voice that says thud, and then once they checked themselves into the hospital, they were supposed to behave like they normally would behave. Now apparently all of their normal everyday behavior was seen as abnormal. And they all got diagnosed with different psychological conditions, and apparently some of them had trouble getting out of the hospitals. The story goes that the patients in the hospital could easily tell the real patients from these fake pseudo-patients, but the doctors couldn't tell the difference. It was a huge embarrassment to the hospitals when Rosenhan came out with his study. He said, it is clear that we cannot distinguish the sane from the insane in psychiatric hospitals. Now, the other thing I want to tell you about the Rosenhan study was very recently there's a book that came out that suggested that some of the data in the Rosenhan studies weren't exactly as they reported it. So if you're interested in learning a little about that, take a look at this book, The Great Pretender. And then fairly quickly after that, DSM-3 came out. Now DSM-5, which we'll talk about in a moment, is really an evolutionary change. But DSM-3, that was a revolutionary change. Very different than DSM-1 and very different from DSM-2. In part, DSM-3 was a reaction to those Rosenhan pseudo-patient studies, and the goals included making it more consistent with the International Classification of Diseases and to make psychiatric diagnosis more uniform. The wake of the Rosenhan studies made it seem like that we didn't really know what we were doing in mental health, and they wanted to make sure that if 5 different mental health care practitioners saw one client, they would all end up with the same diagnosis. How did they get it done so quickly? Well, it was the researchers that came to the rescue. They wanted to make sure that psychiatry was closer to other fields of medicine, and psychiatry was really under attack. So the researchers swooped in and applied what they were already using. So the research diagnostic criteria came out in 1979, and it was really a manual or group of different kinds of diagnoses that research-oriented psychiatrists often used. And what they did was they used the RDC as a base for DSM-3. The guiding principles of the RDC included precise clinical descriptions, laboratory studies that might identify biological markers if they were there, a clear way to determine or distinguish one disorder from another. There's an assumption in the RDC that the categories of diseases are real things that needed to be discovered, and we weren't just making stuff up. And they developed a system that was focused on observable phenomena rather than unconscious phenomena that you might see in DSM-1 and DSM-2, and had sort of an algorithm to it. New features of DSM-3 included a multi-axial system for the first time that's now gone, decision trees, field trials, a focus on cultural and gender differences, the prevalence of conditions, what percentage of people might have it at one time or another, the course of conditions, how symptoms play out over time, as well as family patterns that you might see, and a way to differentiate one diagnosis from another. DSM-3R came out in 1987, just a couple of years after DSM-3, and was really tidying up DSM. They reorganized, deleted, and renamed some categories, and added a new feature of disorders that need to be studied that were kind of previews of disorders that might come out later. Also, hierarchical rules were introduced, so if an individual might get diagnosed with 2 different conditions, it tells you which one to choose. DSM-4 came out in 1994, and because DSM-3 and DSM-3R made it seem like everything could be a disorder, they added this idea of clinical significance, which means that you can't really diagnose someone with a condition unless the symptoms produce clinically significant distress or impairment. And that was introduced back in DSM-4. DSM-4-TR, or text revision, came out in 2000, and it was really, the diagnostic manual was basically the same. What was different from DSM-4 to DSM-4-TR was they updated the statistics. 5 came out in 2013, and it was built upon the perceived flaws of its previous edition, which was DSM-4. First of all, diagnosis doesn't tell us a lot about severity or disability. It doesn't really tell you how severe the condition is or what kinds of problems the condition might cause. Also, high rates of comorbidity. Lots of people get diagnosed with multiple things. And high rates of what were called NOS categories, which were not otherwise specified. They wanted to make sure to account for some of those NOS conditions. And also the DSM was starting to hinder the research process, so it was really time for an update. The guiding principles of the DSM-5 included to optimize clinical utility so the clinicians could use it. They also wanted it to be very evidence-based in terms of the conditions that were listed in it. They wanted to make sure there was some continuity with previous editions. They didn't want it to have the "I don't know what I'm looking at" problem. Probably one of the reasons why they didn't change the personality disorders. And there were no constraints on how different the DSM-5 could be from DSM-4 or TR, as long as it met that continuity with previous editions. They wanted to make sure to emphasize lifespan development. They take a dimensional approach where they could, and then a measurement of distress, disability, and severity. And incorporate what we know about risk factors, prodromes, which are early versions of different disorders, and prevention strategies. And they wanted to make sure that the DSM was a living document. They didn't want to wait some 30 years between editions. So the idea was they were going to make sort of incremental changes to the DSM along the way. In fact, there have been several incremental changes since DSM-5 came out. You might be wondering, why isn't it DSM-5 with that Roman numeral? They made an intentional decision to number it to DSM-5 without Roman numerals because future updates were supposed to be done what they called software styles with these point updates. DSM-5 contains two different sets of codes in it. You'll see ICD-9 codes as well as ICD-10 codes in parentheses. We moved over to the ICD-10 codes in 2015. And so you'll see something here like generalized anxiety disorder, which is 300.02. That's its ICD-9 code. And then F41.2, it's its ICD-10 code. And that still goes over to that International Classification of Diseases. They wanted to make sure also to take into consideration the developmental lifespan approach. DSM-5 is organized in sequence with the developmental lifespan, so the disorders that are listed early in the book happen more early in a person's life, and the ones that are listed later in the book are more likely to happen later, and that's also by chapter as well. There was a goal to have biological markers in DSM-5, and they only ended up with one that I'm familiar with. So some conditions require biological markers. The one I'm familiar with is that narcolepsy does require some evidence of hypocretin deficiency. If there are other biological markers, I haven't seen them quite yet. And they wanted to make sure that to have as many objective tests and not just client reports of their own symptoms. Sleep disorders, for example, often will require a sleep test to be able to confirm that, and also that hypocretin deficiency like I mentioned previously. Also, an increased focus on culture and gender in DSM-5. There's more attention to how culture and gender influence and can be influenced by psychological disorders, and it includes tools for performing a cultural formulation interview to be able to examine those differences. DSM-5 consists of about 20 different chapters. Like I said before, mostly in order of developmental lifespan, with the neurodevelopmental disorders listed first, leading all the way down to the paraphilic and other mental conditions. So that's a quick overview of the history of the DSM and how we came from DSM-1 all the way to DSM-5.